Okay, sorry about that technical difficulty. Just to mind if I just reintroduce, and we'll just back up a little bit for the folks online. There we go. So welcome everyone. Sorry about that glitch. So we'll be recording today's webinar as well as streaming it live online. So folks online, please let us know in that questions pane if you can hear us correctly now. And then our next seminar is Friday, April 5th. James Hull will be from Pedestrian Technology. And today we're hearing from Francesca Petricolo, policy or planner in the Policy Innovation and Regional Collaboration section of Citywide, and Michelle Marks, the City of Portland's Pedestrian Coordinator. Sorry about that. Inconvenience again.
Sure, we'll just back up our slides here and go back to the beginning. Thanks for your patience.
Now, I just move it down there.
Great, thank you. And I have a mic here. Okay, so to help bring the folks online back up to speed, apologize for the difficulties. So I am the Pedestrian Coordinator for the City of Portland, and I, with the help of a fabulous team of staff and consultants, including my colleague Francesca here, have been working for the past 2 years on an update to Portland's citywide pedestrian plan. We call it PedPDX. And I want to walk through the contents of the plan itself, but really take a deep dive looking at the equity components, both in terms of how we are attempting to address inequitable outcomes for both infrastructure and safety within the content of the plan, and also Francesca will talk about how we attempted to have a more equitable public process and ensure that we were hearing the voices of all Portlanders as part of this project. So Francesca, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure, so what is PedPDX? We're working with our technical advisory committee, which are folks from different city boroughs and different agency partners like TriMet and Metro, as well as our City of Portland Pedestrian Advisory Committee and a community advisory committee that is specific for PedPDX. We worked and worked until we came to what we hoped was a sufficiently powerful mission statement. In fact, I should say that we thought we would come to just an overall statement for the plan, a vision for the plan. However, our community advisory committee said we need a mission statement as well. And so we have, through PedPDX, the City of Portland affirms walking as a fundamental human right and the most fundamental means of transportation. PedPDX ensures walking is safe, accessible, and an attractive experience for everyone in Portland, by putting pedestrians at the forefront of city policy and investors and design. And then our vision becomes Portland is a great walking city for all. And our goals include, so we've worked with all and took all of their feedback and distilled it down to these 5 powerful goals: to be equitable and inclusive, make Portland walkable and accessible for all, no matter who you are or where you live, safe and secure, make walking in Portland safe and secure for everyone, comfortable and inviting, provide a comfortable, inviting, and connected pedestrian network that supports neighborhoods and strength communities. And people in an environment was really important to a lot of folks as well. Increase walking for transportation and recreation in Portland as a means of achieving improved health outcomes for all people and for the environment.
Let's see, so having a few technical difficulties here, transitioning to the next slide.
And so the plan is really comprised of 3 main components. It identifies the pedestrian priority network. It identifies and prioritizes all sidewalk crossings and needs within the pedestrian priority network. and it articulates what we're calling our pedestrian toolbox, and that's the key strategies and actions that we'll take to implement the plan.
So before we kind of dive into the content of the plan, I think it's important for us to step back and remind ourselves why this work is important. What problems are we trying to solve? And I think some of this will, of course, be refresher for a lot of us, but we need to step back and talk about why this work is important.
So, first of all, we'll use the word walking sometimes, but that means also you're being a pedestrian with a mobility device. This is all the range of ways that people walk, so we want to acknowledge that. And it's also the reason why we didn't call this a walking plan. We went to our City of Portland Commission on Disabilities, and they said, could you at least lead with pedestrian first, because we want to acknowledge that there's a range of ways that people in disability community think about what walking is, and so with that, communicating that everyone is a pedestrian. And walking is the most accessible form of transportation. So it requires no fare, no license, maybe shoes for a lot of folks, but the relative cost of equipment to walk is super low. So, and it's often the only option for people who are young, old, people with disabilities, people with low incomes, and others who just have limited choices about their mobility. They'll turn to walking first. And also, pedestrian infrastructure is key for those who rely on transit, like the bus or taking the MAX. And poor infrastructure and safety issues tend to be the most exacerbated in high-need communities where the cost, they're cost burdened, and we know that Portlanders are increasingly concentrated in areas where they are more cost burdened. So over here, we see that the orange lines show sidewalk presence. And over here, we see our PBOT equity matrix, which shows income and low income and non-white populations in the darker orange. And what we notice when we compare the two maps is that the areas where there's not enough coverage of sidewalk presence includes Southwest, and then a lot of this area that is East Portland predominantly, which correlates with our PBOT equity matrix, the areas which have high equity needs, high equity concerns. And also I should note that we know that cost burden Portlanders are increasingly being displaced to the periphery of the city in pursuit of affordable housing options. And they're being displaced to neighborhoods that have inadequate pedestrian infrastructure. So also for health outcomes, research shows a strong link between the amount of walking in public and individual health, and that the state of public infrastructure plays a major role in health outcomes. And we have inequitable infrastructure provision may result in inequitable health outcomes. So this raises environmental justice issues. And also for livability, walking is more than just a mode of transportation. Walkable neighborhoods are the foundation of great cities. They're the foundation of great communities. And we need to extend the benefits of walkable neighborhoods to all Portlanders. Nearly 40% of local carbon emissions are from transportation, and walking is the most sustainable, most accessible form of transportation. Again, this points to environmental justice concerns in areas that are burdened by local carbon emissions and unclean air.
And then finally, we know that we need to encourage more people to travel by walking, by bike, by transit in order to help manage the growth that many of our cities are seeing across the country. So this is a diagram from NACTO showing the capacity of different modes of transportation and transportation facilities to move people. And what it shows us is that sidewalks have the capacity to move more people than almost every other mode and facility of transportation there is. So encouraging more people to walk is critical. Now this is an image that I think most of us has probably already seen, showing how much physical space 200 people take up in private cars, on one light rail train, on bikes. But not in this image are sidewalks. And these are photographs from busy downtown Portland streets on a regular lunch hour. And I think what we can take away here is that there's a real opportunity to maximize the capacity of the infrastructure we already have to move people in Portland as demands on our transportation system increase. So getting more people to walk is going to be critical. So to begin our PedPDX work, we really wanted to have a solid understanding of existing conditions, of what the state of walking is in Portland today. Now, walkability is kind of a squishy term, can be difficult to measure. There are all sorts of kind of apps and private companies out there who purport to score walkability. Often, you know, those private algorithms are based on land use destinations, which isn't always something that as transportation professionals we have the ability to influence, though of course the land use transportation nexus is critical. From a transportation perspective alone, there are a couple of kind of data-driven ways that we can measure walkability, so we'll talk about a couple of those. And one is pedestrian safety. So we can look at safety data to give us some indication of how safe our streets and sidewalks are for walking. So we'll take a look at that. Now, Portland is a Vision Zero city, like a lot of other cities in North America and Europe, and we are committed to ending all traffic deaths and serious injuries on our streets by 2025. However, we're not there, nor are we close to being there yet. So we took a look at all pedestrian crashes and fatalities since 2007, and those are indicated in the black lines at the bottom of this graph. And you can see that in any given year, we have anywhere from 5 to upwards of 20 people dying on our streets in Portland just walking. So even one is too many. And what's more, we also know that pedestrians suffer a disproportionate impact with traffic safety issues. So the chart on the top of the page here shows that about 9% of trips in Portland are walking trips. This is based on some survey data done by the City of Portland a few years ago. However, 31% of traffic deaths are pedestrian deaths. So a hugely disproportionate impact here. People walking in Portland are 10 times more likely than people driving to sustain a serious or fatal injury. About 20% of all pedestrian crashes in Portland will result in a fatality or serious injury. And we know that Portlanders that have to walk, including those who are transit reliant, are most exposed to these systemic safety issues. So to put a finer point on that, people walking in East Portland, the area of the city where we have the highest non-white and low income population, die in traffic at twice the rate of people walking elsewhere in Portland on a per person basis. This is not okay. So we looked again at all crashes since 2006, and just in sheer numbers, crashes have gone up about 25% during this time period, and even factoring in the city's population growth, which is about 17%, the crash rate is also going up. So we have a problem here, and we really wanted to understand this better as part of our process. So with our fabulous consultant team who led on this, we did a citywide analysis of every single pedestrian crash in the city of Portland over the last 10 years. And the hope was to identify the potentially correlative factors that may be creating risk for pedestrians. So looking at behavioral factors, roadway design factors that may be correlated with crashes, because we really don't want to chase crashes. We don't want to be delivering improvements to roadways after somebody has died on that street. We really want to get in front of those crashes and make changes before crashes happen. So I'm going to walk you through some of the key findings from that analysis. We looked at all 10 years of crash data to see if there were any potential temporal correlations that we could identify. So the graph you see on the table here charts crashes by time of year and time of day. So what you can see here is that crashes go down in the lighter summer months, May, June, July, August, and the number of crashes go up in the darker winter months, November, December, January. Now, if you looked at the curve for pedestrian activity, we would see the opposite, right? So crashes are going up in the dark winter months, despite the fact that actual number of people walking goes down. What's more, the darker colors on these bars, everything but light blue, those are non-daylight hours. So dawn, dusk, complete darkness. So you can see, as you might expect, in those darker winter months, the number of crashes happening in those non-daylight hours is also going up. So we know we've got a lighting issue that we need to look at in Portland. So we have directly incorporated this into our strategies and actions that we'll talk about later. So in addition to temporal trends, we also looked at location trends. Our consultants looked at 10 years of crash data and looked at where those were occurring. Again, this may be a surprise to some, but not to others. Over 40% of pedestrian crashes are happening at signalized intersections. And about 33% of those crashes are serious injury and fatal crashes. So I think there are some who might consider the traffic signal as the pedestrian improvement. If there was no crossing before, add the signal, and now we have a signalized pedestrian crossing opportunity. However, what this data shows us is that the existence of the traffic signal alone is not enough to provide a safe crossing opportunity for pedestrians. And if we looked at this data and broke it down even further, we would see that the majority of these signalized intersection crashes are happening when the pedestrian has a walk and the vehicle has a permissive left turn. In fact, the majority of these crashes occurred at signals when the pedestrian has the walk signal. So we know that we need to take a hard look at our policies, practices, for when and where we need to be separating that pedestrian crossing phase from both the left and the right turning vehicle phase. This is also something that we folded into our toolbox. And then finally, we also looked at what types of streets pedestrian crashes were occurring on. Now, the majority of streets in Portland are two-lane roadways. They make up 96% of our network. However, the pedestrian crashes are happening on the remaining 4% of the network. So 3- and 4-lane streets are over 5 times more likely to see a pedestrian crash than a 2-lane street. And streets with 5 or more lanes are 11 times more likely to see a pedestrian crash than a 2-lane roadway. So again, we folded this information directly into how we prioritize improvements. We'll walk through that in a moment. So that's safety. We also looked at the state of the pedestrian network, also clearly an important indication for how walkable a city is, how complete or incomplete your network is. So we went back and looked at all of the new sidewalks that were constructed in Portland under the 1998 pedestrian plan. That plan was in place for 20 years. These were the sidewalks that existed before the 98 pedestrian plan existed in Portland, all these orange lines. And the darker orange lines were the sidewalks that were either built, repaired, rebuilt during that 20-year plan. So I like to kind of toggle back and forth here because it's kind of fun to see where the activity occurred. And you can see there's a lot of construction out in East Portland, some in Southwest, a lot in downtown and the Interstate Max line. So we built about 250 miles of sidewalk in 20 years, and that includes capital projects, but also sidewalks built in conjunction with private development. So in Portland, when you provide a new development, you have to improve the sidewalk frontage in front of your building, and that's a large portion of the new sidewalk that we've seen in this period. That said, while 250 miles is great, we know we still have a problem. So the popular conception of Portland is probably what you see in the image of the top here. However, we know, people who live in this city know that we have a lot of the image at the bottom. And we identified where. So we looked at every single street in Portland and identified based on our asset management data where we know we have sidewalk gaps. So the streets in green on this map are streets where we have sidewalks on both sides of the street. The streets in blue are locations where we have a sidewalk on one side of the street, and the streets in purple are where we have no sidewalk present on either side of the street. And I think we can all see some geographic patterns here. Clearly, a lot of gaps in Southwest Portland and Outer East and North Portland. And just to put some numbers behind that, 32% of our busy arterial and collector streets are lacking sidewalks on both sides of the roadway. That's a really scary big number. In terms of linear miles, that means we have about 350 linear miles of missing sidewalk on our busy streets. I want to emphasize this does not include local neighborhood streets, busy arterial collectors alone. Now let's go back and rewind to how much we built in the last 20 years, we built 250 miles. So this gap is outside of what we can accomplish in the 20-year horizon of this plan. So this, I think, tells us two things. One is that we have to prioritize, and two, we have to get creative. Crossings. So we went and looked at the same data for crossings. So these were crossings that existed before the 1998 plan was adopted. And these are all the crossings that we provided, painted, repainted in that 20 years. Again, just toggling back and forth so you can see where the work took place. And you can see where the density of crossings lies in Portland. It gets less and less dense as you emanate out from the center of the city. And this is what we end up with. This is a photo of a gentleman trying to cross the street on Outer Division. Not a single marked crossing opportunity in sight. This gentleman has no other choice but to do what he's doing right here. Now, PedPDX intentionally places great emphasis on crossings as a critical piece of the pedestrian network, and we knew we needed to fix this problem. But in order to identify gaps in the crossing network, we knew we needed some guideline to some guidance for how frequently we should be providing marked pedestrian crossing opportunities on the network. Otherwise, it's difficult to identify where you have gaps or to quantify your needs citywide, or even to have kind of a programmatic and a proactive way to address gaps. Unfortunately, however, we could not find any precedent out there, nor any clear research to use as guidance. No clear research telling us how far out of direction a pedestrian is willing to travel to access a marked crossing opportunity. So without that kind of precedence or guidance, we just kind of made something up. And to be clear, the new crossing guidelines that are part of PedPDX are based on existing local policy foundation. We really used the city and the region's connectivity standards as our starting point. But PedPDX does include new guidelines for how frequently we want to see marked crossing opportunities in Portland moving forward, and they're pretty aggressive. So what we're saying is within pedestrian districts, so these are all of our centers where we have a density of pedestrian destinations, service, schools, jobs, housing, places like the Center City and Gateway. We want to see marked crossing opportunities in Portland about every 530 feet. So on with Portland's 200-foot block module, that's about every other block as a minimum. Outside of those dense pedestrian districts, we would like to see marked crossing opportunities approximately every 800 feet. So these are kind of our arterial and collector streets where we have transit and other services where people are still walking, but perhaps not in as high a number. So 800 feet, that's about every 3 blocks on that 200-foot block module. And then finally, our new guidelines say that we will be providing marked crossings at every transit stop in the city of Portland. And I get it right on. So before kind of proclaiming this in the plan and making this official PBOT guideline standard language, we tested it. So some of you may be familiar with our Outer Division multimodal safety project. Outer Division is one of Portland's high crash corridors, and PBOT is in the process now of designing safety improvements that will be constructed next year to make it safer for biking, walking, driving as well. So we worked with the project management team working on this project and said, hey, can you test these spacing guidelines for us and see if they make sense on the ground? And they did. So what you see here is a map of the Outer Division project corridor. It runs from 82nd all the way to the Portland city limits. That's about 100 blocks. So it's a really long extent. And in that 100 blocks, there exists today exactly 17 marked crossing opportunities, those you see on the map. With the division improvements, which will be implementing our new spacing standards, we will see 40 crossing opportunities. So we are able to meet these crossing spacing standards and will be providing more crossings on Outer Division. So if this works in Outer Division, we decided it could work citywide. So this is now part of not only PedPDX, but we are already practicing this at PBOT. All new capital projects moving forward do need to evaluate the crossing spacing as part of their project extent and provide marked crossing opportunities in compliance with that spacing as part of the project. So we're going to see a lot more crossings coming to Portland. And again, I want to underscore how important this piece is. New City of Portland policy is that we will be providing marked crossings at all transit stops. So this means PBOT projects will be working with our transit agency, TriMet, to either adjust the location of bus stops to crossings, consolidate bus stops, provide new crossings at bus stops that where they don't exist. This is a real partnership with TriMet, and I want to publicly thank them for their partnership in this. But moving forward, as capital projects roll out, those bus stops and crossings are going to be co-located, and this is a huge, huge equity issue. We know that it's lower income communities who are more transit reliant. So same thing with sidewalks. We looked at the whole network to see where crossings were missing, applied our crossing spacing guidelines to every street in the city. Streets in green are those where we are currently meeting our new crossing spacing. Streets in purple are street segments that are not currently meeting our desired crossing spacing. And the little dots in blue that are a little bit hard to see are existing marked crossings where we need to go back and evaluate because they may not be designed up to our current design guidelines. So it might just be a marked crossing that we also need to evaluate to see whether we need to provide a flashing beacon or a median island, for example. So looking at this gap analysis, we have about 3,500 marked crossings that we need to meet our new crossing spacing guidelines. So again, rewinding back to what we provided in the previous 20 years, we marked and remarked about 2,500. So again, we have considerably more need than we will have resources to address in the next 20 years. So I'm going to transition to Francesca.
Great, and I get to talk a little bit about the people of this planning work. So talking a lot about the crossings and the sidewalks that we need. This plan really is about the people. And so we put out far and wide and ask for folks to join our community advisory committee for PedPDX. These are just some of the photos of the 25 folks who ended up joining us on this 2-year adventure. 260 applications we received from all over the city, and that's a tremendous amount. Really surprised us. This was, however, right after the presidential elections, and we wondered if perhaps folks wanted to get more engaged in their local community and be the change that they wish to see. We were grateful that they decided to take that out on our pedestrian plan because we were able to get folks representing each area of the city geographically. So 3 folks basically from all different areas of the city, as well as representing a full range and diversity racially and with disabilities. We had 2 people who were blind on our committee, multiple people with different kinds of disabilities, and this was a powerful group who really wanted to get out and help do a lot of the community engagement within their communities. Another way that we wanted to bring in the range and diversity of needs that people have when it comes to walking was to, we originally had this idea to do a video about PedPDX, which then America Walks and the American Planning Association gave us a little bit of money for, which we turned into just stretching that shoestring a lot farther. Doing a partnership with the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communications here in Portland. A class ended up focusing on PedPDX, and they worked in small groups, and they chose people to get to work with them to tell their walking stories, their pedestrian stories. And then that inspired the City of Portland Commission on Disabilities to send in their own revenue and feature stories of 2 of their commissioners. So there's actually 2 more stories that we have on our website as well. So if you go to pedpdx.com, you'll be able to see all 10 of these little mini documentaries about what it's like to walk as a different person in a different area of the city, just really exploring that range and diversity of needs and experiences that people have. What I also want to say about that is, these videos have been viewed over 25,000 times cumulatively. And so we believe that this is having an impact on empathy when folks are seeing one of our community advisory committee members who's blind try to actually cross one of our streets, expecting to find a landing place on the other side of the street and not finding that. When we had our viewing party at the University of Oregon, the whole room gasped, and I realized that's an opportunity for us to show when we're prioritizing needs, not everyone is going to win, but it means that the places that need the resources the most are going to be served, and that's what that means in a really human way. So the pedestrian priority network and the prioritization of needs within it were directly shaped by the community input received in the Walking Priorities Survey. And through the help of our community advisory committee members who really put in the work for this, we were able to get over 5,400 survey responses. We did that in multiple different means and modes, and we did it in 5 different languages. So citywide, the top languages spoken besides English are Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Spanish. So we had our survey in all of those languages. And one of the key questions that we asked was, which kinds of places are the most important to improve for walking in Portland? And we heard, we separated out by area of town. So this is a map of the city of Portland. And we heard basically the same things, although in some areas a little bit different order. And these are the top things that we heard, and it really harkened down to equity, safety, and demand. Midway through our process, because we had this priorities survey open all summer long in 2017, we stopped to take a look. What are the demographics of the folks who are responding to our survey right now, and where do we need to put more energy in, both geographically and by our demographic makeup by race and ethnicity. Our community advisory committee gave us some suggestions, and they themselves worked hard to help increase the numbers. For example, in East Portland, as we were seeing that those were a little lower than citywide average. And we recognized that we were making specific interventions, or if you will, we were doing our engagement in Spanish. And so we worked to try to increase our Hispanic Latino survey responses. Overall, these are the overall results, and the Hispanic Latino results that we received were 5%. However, citywide, they represent 10% of our population. However, with our Black African American survey respondents, we only received 2%. However, that they make up 6% of the city overall. And we weren't able to budge that number with the efforts that we did ourselves during this process. So we took a look at that and we said, that's not fair. That's not what we want to do. We know of or knew of some research that was done here at the Portland State University about driver yielding behavior. I think I pulled it up on my phone. I wanted to thank the researchers for that. It really inspired us to dig in deeper. And we also, recognized other factors like pedestrians who are stopped at higher rates. If they are Black, African American, they're stopped by police more often. What we did is we came to our constituent services coordinator, Tosin Abiodun, and Irene Marion, who was at the time our Bureau's public involvement coordinator. Both are Black Portlanders and working in this work. And they put together, designed, and led 2 really powerful focus groups we called Walking While Black. We heard from about 50 Black Portlanders through this work, and the key thing that we learned that was different to our Walking While Black participants was poor lighting. Now you can see that's the top priority from our participants. However, citywide in our survey, poor lighting was much lower. We did, however, we did decide to take these top priorities and move them directly into our strategies and actions to better serve our Black Portlanders with the recommendations and suggestions that they gave in our Walking While Black focus group. So big thank you to Irene Marion and Tosin Abiodun for that work. We started, when we published our Walking While Black report, we started getting emails, comments on Facebook. It's cute. It's folks who were like, we had no idea there was any problem like this. And I think that that's the lens of whiteness that happens. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to elevate some of these direct quotes from our focus groups in case anyone is having that kind of experience today. When you're Black anywhere in Portland, you have to make sure that you are extra careful when crossing the street or using the crosswalk. I pay a large amount of money for my son's car insurance because it is safer for him to drive than to be exposed. I won't allow my husband to run at night as a tall Black man, for I fear he won't come home. I want to lose weight by walking, but can't walk after 5 p.m. because I'm afraid to exercise when it gets dark. I feel vulnerable, so I stay home or drive, and it is impacting my health. The political climate has become more hostile for Black people. A Somali woman was crossing at a green light. People were yelling at her for no reason. Being the target of racial slurs when crossing the street, I press the button to get the green light, then someone yells racial slurs at me because they have a vehicle and don't like that they were made to wait for me. Crosswalk, white girl magic, where cars stop for white women, not for Black people. And so we directly, we recognized that when we talk about safety, we often talk about crash safety. It's about those who are being killed or seriously injured on our streets. But this is also about personal security, and personal security is significantly impacting the choices, the transportation choices that people in our Black community are making. And so we included public safety as one of the objectives of PedPDX and included in our strategies and actions things to meet that objective. So thank you also to the ERCO Africa House, PALF, and the Black Parent Initiative who participated in helping getting folks to those focus groups. We also had a advisory committee member who has disabilities, and she wanted to lead other people with disabilities to participate in directly influencing our strategies and actions. And so we worked with her to design a focus group or a workshop, a disability workshop, where folks did just that. They brainstormed the solutions that they'd like to see for Portland sidewalks and crossings, and we directly put those recommendations into the plan.
Great. Thanks. So I think we have maybe about 5 minutes left to present. So I'll very quickly walk through how how we prioritized all of those needs we saw a moment ago. So PedPDX does establish a data-based approach for prioritizing pedestrian infrastructure. And there are a few reasons. So we want to make sure, given the enormity of need out there, that we are directing our limited public resources to the greatest needs first. And this allows us, a data-based approach, to align that spending with our adopted plan goals and city goals. And really, the intent is to ensure that we're providing improvements in an equitable manner across the city. What we do not want to do is just be complaint driven. I think we know that there are some members of the community who are very well versed when it comes to knowing how to pick up the phone and call City Hall, and some who are not as experienced at that, especially after working a hard day's work. So our approach. We went back to what we heard in the community survey about equity, safety, and demand being our most important priorities from Portlanders. So that's what we did. We looked at every street and analyzed equity needs on those streets using the PBOT equity analysis, which looks at race and income by census tract. So the dark purple streets here are those where we have a higher equity concerns, more non-white and lower income residents. The streets in light green and green are where we have fewer equity concerns. We also looked at safety. Now again, when scoring safety on our network, we did not want to look to only where crashes had occurred. So we did go back and pull those risk factors that we identified as part of our safety analysis. So our safety scores are based on, yes, where crashes have happened and where our high crash network is, but also on those risk factors where there are streets with 3 or more travel lanes and where posted speeds are significant. So the streets in green and orange here are locations where we know we have safety needs, and the streets in blue and green are where we have fewer safety concerns. And then finally, pedestrian demand. So where are people walking? So we quantified our pedestrian street types. So pedestrian districts, where we have the most people walking, receive the highest points, on down to city walkways, all the way down to local streets, receiving fewer points. So the locations in dark blue and blue are where we have more people walking, and in green here, the fewest people walking. And we essentially compiled the 3 of these evenly, equity, safety, and demand, and scored our whole network. And so what we get here are locations in purple, tier 1, red tier 2, yellow tier 3. These are locations where we have the most equity and safety concerns and the highest numbers of people walking. So these street segments, in theory, would be our priorities, and we went back and matched up those gaps in the sidewalk network and gaps in the crossing network to those high priority locations. So the outcome here, the output rather, are priority crossing and sidewalk improvements. So these are the locations that PedPDX suggests will be our investment priorities in the near term for new sidewalks and crossings. So finally, I have a couple minutes left. I'll speak to what we call the PedPDX toolbox. And the toolbox is really more of a programmatic work plan for all of PBOT's pedestrian related programs and activities, and the city as well. And it's organized by strategies. There are 13 strategies and a series of actions that the city is committing to help implement that strategy. And they all tie back to those objectives. Each of our actions are intended to help us reach the objectives Francesca showed us to. There are 66 actions with a series of cut sheets for each in the plan. I obviously can't walk you through 66 actions, but I can show you just a couple representative actions before we run out of time. One of those being to apply our new marked crossing spacing guidelines as part of capital projects. We already talked about that. But looking at visibility of pedestrians at crossings. So Portland is visiting or has visited our vision clearance guidelines. So we will now be setting back parked vehicles from intersections to improve visibility at crossings. Lots of cheers for that. I'm one of them. We are also changing our crossing marking guidelines. Instead of 2 transverse lines at signals, we'll be providing high visibility, kind of continental or zebra style markings citywide to increase visibility of those crossings. And we will be working with the city traffic engineer, with our signals and street lighting staff, and our Vision Zero team to develop guidelines and practices for separating vehicle turning movements from pedestrian walks. You will soon be seeing a pilot or 2 to study prohibiting turn on red in a couple locations in Portland. We're looking at ways to slow turning movements where they are allowed. So here's an example of a raised crosswalk to slow right turning movements where you have kind of non-arterial, arterial intersections. We're hoping to dramatically expand our automated speed enforcement, dramatically expand our crosswalk enforcement education and activities, looking for ways to help homeowners finance and bring down the cost of sidewalk repair, and updating our sidewalk repair practices to not just be complaint driven but proactive. Giving disabled community members a forum through which they can report drainage issues at curb ramps, which is an issue in the rainy Northwest. And then addressing those public safety and security concerns we heard from our focus groups. So increasing lighting in underserved communities. PedPDX includes new lighting level guidelines that will be in effect citywide to increase lighting, not just on the roadways, but on the sidewalk corridors and the crossings as well. Working with our partners and other agencies to enhance the well-being and personal security of vulnerable communities. There is an interagency effort to help address hate in our streets. And then finally, we want to be partners to folks like your community, the Portland State community. How can we be partners to continue research on things like racial bias in driving? So with that, I want to say thank you very much. Our contact information is here. Feel free to email us with any questions you may have that you don't get to ask us today. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for some questions, and I'll just ask if you can say it to the microphone so the folks online can hear as well. And I thought we would kick it off with somebody from online. Gabriel asked, was there specific areas that were identified as having poor lighting as part of this process? And if so, where were they clustered, or is it more of a decentralized phenomenon?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, our Vision Zero team has been doing a lot of work looking at lighting conditions in Portland. In particular, some of our streets in outer Portland where we have more of our 4 and 5 lane arterials. These are locations where we have lighting fixtures on one side of the street only and not the other. We've not gone out and measured lighting levels, but we know for a 5 lane roadway, lights on one side is not going to be enough. So we know that it's an issue in outer East Portland. Thanks.
Speaking to the parking setbacks, do you see a particular path forward for implementation? Is this something that is going to be applied across the city? Are we starting in the central city? Are we starting at particular identifying locations, or is it going to be complaint driven?
Thanks. No, it's not going to be complaint driven. So this is a new design guideline for Portland. For those not in Portland historically, you have been allowed to park your vehicle up to the corner at an intersection, which is, we'll just say, not best practice. And so as a new design guideline, it will be implemented in conjunction with new capital projects rolling forward. We don't have plans for massive retrofits nor funding for massive retrofits across the city. The one exception to that, though, is that you'll see in our 66 actions in the plan, there are going to be a couple of programs that will go back and do some evaluation on their networks. That includes the Safe Routes to School program and neighborhood greenways. Thank you.
On the capital funds that you're talking about, how is it going to be funded? And you're talking about private in terms of if new developments are happening, they have to implement some of those measures. And if so, what about areas that no new development will be happening in a long time? Is PBOT funding that, and how are you guys doing that?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, new development will have to bring their sidewalks up to standard. They always have in Portland. But that's exactly it. We recognize that we can't rely on that everywhere. So that's why we do have an identified list of capital projects that are priorities for us. So Portland has a 20-year capital project list in our transportation system plan. So that's where those big projects live. And then we also have a series of programs that deliver smaller, more spot improvements. So the TSP has projects that are $1 million and over, and the programs deliver spot improvements that are less than $1 million. So the Pedestrian Network Completion Program, which is the program that I manage, will be providing spot improvements to help us implement the priorities here.
Thanks for the great presentation and all the good work that's gone into this. I had a question about the marked crosswalk spacing. So we know that from research that sometimes marked crosswalks are just not enough, and we need additional other safety countermeasures and enhancements. So I was wondering if there's any additional guidance in the plan to maybe update or inform the guidance that's already out there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that question. So the crossing spacing guidelines is silent on the type of crossing that goes in there. Now, the city of Portland does already have design guidelines to tell us what type of crossing needs to go in based on traffic volumes and vehicle width. It's all based on the NCHRP 562 report. So we already have really clear guidance on what type of improvements to provide. It was really the how often we should be providing it piece that we were lacking. Now, I will say that crossing demand was a huge issue we had to address, because research shows that in some locations, if you mark a crossing, it can actually decrease safety if there aren't enough people crossing the street there, or if crossing pedestrians aren't expected by drivers. So traditionally in Portland, we have had to demonstrate that there are at least 20 people biking or crossing the street in that location to mark the crosswalk. We are tweaking that a little bit with our guidelines, and what we're saying now is that within a pedestrian district, those high volume locations, we will no longer require showing demonstrating existing demand to mark those crosswalks. Neither will we require that at a transit stop. It's important for us, enough for us, that we mark those transit stops, that we will mark it without documenting existing demand and provide the enhancements necessary to provide safety. However, in between transit stops and pedestrian centers, we do still want to make sure that there are at least 20 people crossing the road there, just so that we don't put ourselves in a position where we get potential driver non-compliance.
Great, thank you. So Zach Online asks, was lowering roadway speed limits considered as part of the pedestrian safety improvements in addition to the infrastructure construction?
Absolutely, and lowering speed limits is one of our actions. Thank you for asking that. And I will mention our wonderful Vision Zero team at PBOT, who is working every day to bring speed limits, posted speed limits down in Portland, and they absolutely continue to plan to be continue to be aggressive on that front. So yes, thank you.
Thanks for this great rigorous process that you went through. It's great to see pedestrians being prioritized by the city. I do have a question about the pedestrian districts and the non-pedestrian districts. And given the long 20-year time horizon, why did you choose to differentiate between the needs of the pedestrian districts and the non-pedestrian districts, and what are some of the metrics you use to define a pedestrian district?
Thank you, excellent question. So due to time, I unfortunately couldn't acquaint you with all 350 pages of our plan, but yes, the piece that we didn't talk about was that pedestrian priority network, where we identify our pedestrian classifications in Portland. Pedestrian districts are a piece of that. We also have
major city walkways and city walkways and neighborhood walkways. So the pedestrian districts, to answer your question, they correlate one-to-one with our comprehensive plan centers. So everywhere the comprehensive plan is intending to focus growth and housing and jobs and transit, we also call that a pedestrian district so that we can make sure our land use and transportation policies are working together.
So outer division would not qualify for a pedestrian district?
Outer division, we call a major city walkway. It's one step down. Major city walkways are all of our corridors and main streets from our transportation plan, as well as our entire frequent transit network. And outer division is part of the frequent transit network because we know frequent transit is a huge pedestrian generator. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question with our online audience, but then for those of you in the room, we'll bring out our donuts and we encourage you to come up and say hello and ask any other unanswered questions that you have.
Thank you. I'm glad I made the cut. So street trees have been shown to be really important pedestrian safety infrastructure, not only by separating those fast cars from the pedestrians, but making it a nicer environment so that people are more inclined to want to walk in, and all the other health benefits that trees provide. I wonder if some of the partners that you plan, I'm sorry, I haven't looked at your plan yet. 66 actions, that's exciting. Where does one start? I wonder if some of the folks you're partnering with are folks who are tree people.
Absolutely. So we are working with urban forestry staff here at the city, and we'll be working with the Urban Forestry Commission to figure out how to solve some of the conflicts that naturally arise between sidewalks and trees. And to be clear, all of the pedestrian advocates that we work with feel the same as you do, and as do I. Trees are a critical piece of the pedestrian infrastructure, but we do know that there are some issues we need to solve. So what can we do to give trees more space in the right of way so that they're not uplifting sidewalks? When sidewalks are cracked and buckled by roots, how can we go out there jointly with PBOT Sidewalk Repair and urban forestry staff to figure out together what needs to be done to fix the situation? How can we develop a toolkit of options that we can apply when we have tree sidewalk conflicts? So we're absolutely going to be doing that work together with our urban forestry partners. And thank you, if you're listening, for participating with us.
Yes, there were comments that came in online that said, hooray, crosswalks, thank you for doing this work. And of course, thank you for presenting here today.
Thank you. We were happy to come. Thank you for your time.
Oh, you see something. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Clint.
Yeah.
Hi.
You got to take all the questions. They weren't actually.
Yeah, I was planning to defer on public comment. Nice to meet you. Hi. For the presentation. Thanks for coming. I have a question. I'm curious